the United States has carried out a series of strikes against Venezuela, announcing the capture of Nicolas Maduro and his wife.
Nicolas Maduro stood in federal court and pleaded not guilty to narco-terrorism charges.
Donald Trump said his military buildup in the Caribbean and destruction of civilian boats there was about alleged drug trafficking. But following the U.S. attack on Venezuela, another reason has taken center stage.
The oil business in Venezuela has been a bust, a total bust, for a long period of time.
Everything that we've seen during his second administration has been consistent with his view that the U.S. energy dominance is key to his agenda.
We're going to have our very large United States oil companies go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
But one U.S. oil company is already there and has been for decades.
Chevron produces about 25% of Venezuela's oil today, is the largest investor in the oil industry and in the country.
We've been in Venezuela for the last 100 years. Our presence there, we believe, is important for the local economy, the regional economy, the people of Venezuela.
This is a story about the extent to which a US oil company is willing to go through the trials and tribulations of geopolitics in order to stay in a country that has the world's biggest oil reserves.
Chevron has virtually no competition. It has no oversight. And so it's really a very unique situation.
So how did Chevron manage to stay in Venezuela when everyone else left? And what role could it play in the country's future if Trump gets his way?
Venezuela, on paper, has more than 300 billion barrels of oil.
Or roughly 17% of the world's known oil reserves.
Most of those reserves are in this vast deposit known as the Orinoco Oil Belt.
But there's even more potential underground.
The U.S. Geological Survey estimates that Venezuela has more than 1 trillion barrels of oil in place in the Orinoco Belt. To put it in perspective, the world, until today, has consumed about 1.5 trillion.
The chances are they are going to outlast the world's demand for oil, so effectively they are limitless.
And here in Venezuela, a forest of oil derricks grows from the water of Lake Maracaibo.
The golden age of Venezuelan oil sector was in the 1940s to late 50s, early 60s. The bigger players were Exxon and Shell, but Chevron too made a lot of money basically exporting oil from Venezuela to the United States.
The situation couldn't last forever.
You had these social tensions start to come into play, like in many resource-owning countries around the world, where people start to question, are we as the resource owners benefiting enough from our oil reserves?
In 1960, Venezuela became a founding member of OPEC, a cartel of oil-producing countries that managed supply and thus prices. And by the mid-70s, these were skyrocketing. This brought enormous wealth into Venezuela. By the end of that decade, its entire industry had been nationalized into the company Petróleos de Venezuela, known as PDVSA.
People in Venezuela at that time lived quite prosperous lives. You had stories of secretaries flying to Miami for the weekend to go shopping. You later have beauty pageants and things like that Venezuela sort of became known for, sort of showy wealth.
PDVSA became one of the most successful state-run oil companies, but there was a limit to how far it could operate on its own.
The government wasn't reinvesting enough in these oil assets, causing them to be run down.
And remember the Orinoco Belt? Those reserves come with a caveat.
Almost all of that oil is just too heavy, too sludgy to get out of the ground. In fact, it doesn't move without some sort of diluent to allow it to flow. Unlike, say, the lighter oil that comes from Saudi Arabia, Venezuela at that point really needed that foreign private investment, a whole lot of expertise, a whole lot of capital to get it out of the ground, process it, and to get it to market.
The government decided to open up its oil industry back to the oil majors.
and Venezuela was still attractive. Even today, heavy oil, mainly from Canada, makes up more than half of U.S. crude imports.
Refiners in the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana like Venezuelan heavy oil because their refineries were optimized for that type of oil.
In 1998, Hugo Chavez, a former military officer who had been imprisoned for a failed coup d'etat, won the presidency. His victory ushered in a wave of new state controls.
He passed a number of laws in the early 2000s, which effectively meant that PDVSA, the state-owned oil company, had to own a majority share in all the joint ventures across the country.
The two bigger American companies, which were Exxon and Conoco, decided to leave the country to not upset the new terms that Chavez had imposed, and basically they went into international arbitration.
Chevron, however, took a different approach.
Chevron's Venezuelan business was led by Ali Mashiri, who ran their Latin American operations. He had a very strong personal relationship with Hugo Chavez. This was really the beginning of kind of a special relationship between Chevron and Venezuela that no other foreign oil company enjoyed.
To give you an idea, 20 years later today, Conoco is still owed, for example, more than $10 billion from the awards of arbitrations.
When Hugo Chavez was elected, oil prices were only $25 a barrel. So while he was enacting this period of reforms, oil prices rose up to a record high of $146 a barrel.
But the oil revenue was mismanaged and went into other government spending.
Chavez was running deficits of almost 20% of GDP in the middle of the high price peak.
The amount of corruption that quickly developed, the amount of mismanagement of the oil industry was quite dramatic.
This was the situation Nicolas Maduro inherited when he took office following Chavez's death in 2013.
So the economy was already in deep trouble and it went into a tailspin. It basically reached hyperinflation.
And it remains a persistent problem that, for outside observers, is near impossible to gauge. Bloomberg's Café con Leche Index, as the name would suggest, tracks just one item, a cup of coffee. Its price has increased 587% over the past 12 months.
Across the country, people's savings started to get wiped out. There was huge economic disarray. This caused a groundswell of protests domestically.
Tens of thousands took to the streets of Venezuela today, demanding that aid be allowed to flow into the country,
which Nicolas Maduro clamped down on pretty hard.
This shows how Venezuela's contribution to the world's oil supply dwindled during this period. Meanwhile, Donald Trump was in his first term and took a decidedly hardline approach, backing opposition lawmaker Juan Guaido's bid to take control.
Joining us in the gallery is the true and legitimate president of Venezuela, Juan Guaido. Mr. President.
Trump imposed financial sanctions in order to exert pressure for some kind of positive change within the country. Initially, they did not touch the oil industry, but later Trump heightened those sanctions. This is a major problem now for Chevron.
But the company managed to preserve its assets. And when Joe Biden became president, even more leniency was granted, and production bounced back.
The Biden administration said, we're going to try carrots and sticks to try to coax Maduro into reversing some of that democratic backsliding, to hold free and fair elections. One of those carrots was Chevron.
This helped stabilize the country's economy.
Chevron brings in dollars to the economy and helps to reduce inflation.
That Chevron's been allowed continuous operations underscores just how central its presence has become to Venezuela and the U.S.
Chevron has been making the argument for years that if it is forced to pull out of Venezuela, U.S. adversaries will simply move right in. And here it's talking about China, it's talking about Russia. And this argument has been very persuasive in some circles in Washington, which is part of the reason why Chevron has stayed for as long as it has.
And now all eyes are on how much it and other oil companies might be involved in what happens next. But fully exploiting Venezuela's oil resources won't be fast, and there's no clear financial incentive to do so.
Oil prices actually notched their worst annual decline since 2020 this past year. Part of the reason for that is the oversupply in the market right now. Some analysts estimate it could take a few months to return production to above maybe 1 million barrels a day, but over the long term, it's going to take upwards of $10 billion a year for a total of maybe 10 years to bring Venezuela back to its peak production levels seen in about the 70s.
Oil companies are no stranger to challenging environments, but the political instability, the environmental liabilities, the really precarious state of the infrastructure, the crime, it's a very, very tough place to be.
A big part of what we're all looking to now find out is whether the Trump administration will provide concessions that incentivize these companies to come back despite their past grievances.
We are going to run the country until such time as a proper transition can take place.
So while the international fallout from Trump's attack continues, and the future of Venezuela is incredibly unclear, there is a takeaway. Chevron may be the player facing the best odds.
Like many places in the world, we have to take a long view on our presence in countries like this.
Chevron has is what Wall Street calls an option value. Now, this is a bit like putting one chip on the roulette wheel every single year. And you may not win this year, you may not win next year, you may not win the year after. But at some point, you will win. And when you win, you're going to win big.